I didn't expect her to be there when I walked into the repair shop that Tuesday morning. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, and the smell of motor oil and coffee lingered in the corners like it belonged there. I'd been coming in for weeks, mostly for work on my bike, but today something felt different, like the air had shifted in a way I couldn't name. She was behind the counter, arms crossed, scanning a clipboard with that sharp, careful focus that made it impossible to look away. Mid-40s, confident without trying, the kind of woman who moves through a room like she owns it but doesn't need anyone to notice. I caught her glance once, maybe twice, as I set my helmet down, and there was a flicker, subtle, almost imperceptible, like recognition mixed with curiosity. "You'll regret this," she said, not looking up, voice low but clear, as if the words had weight I hadn't earned yet. I froze for a second. Part of me wanted to apologize, step back, leave the helmet where it was. But some part of me, a stubborn, reckless part, just smiled. "Not if it's with you," I said, and immediately regretted it, my stomach twisting in that familiar, electric knot. She finally looked up then, eyes scanning me fully this time, and I caught a small smile, half amusement, half something I couldn't name. There was a beat where we just looked at each other, neither of us speaking. The clipboard remained in her hands like a shield, but her posture softened slightly, shoulders easing as if the words hadn't been a challenge, but a test. I moved closer to the counter, pretending to check my bike, but really just to be near that strange pull she seemed to radiate. There was a warmth in her presence, subtle, unspoken, but it settled in my chest in a way I didn't know how to process. She handed me a form, and our fingers brushed briefly. A normal motion, the kind that would have gone unnoticed on anyone else, but with her, it lingered. "So," she said, finally, tilting her head as if she'd just remembered why I was there. "Your bike, still making that annoying rattle." I nodded, trying not to let my voice crack, though the way she leaned slightly over the counter, eyes sharp but soft, made it impossible to focus entirely on the words. "Yeah, it's persistent," I muttered, mostly to buy time. I wanted to ask something, anything, but the words dissolved before they left my mouth. She looked down at the clipboard again, but her pen hovered over the paper like she was thinking about something else entirely. The silence stretched just long enough for me to notice the little things. The curl of her hair falling over her shoulder, the faint perfume that reminded me of old bookstores, the way her fingers tapped the edge of the counter absent-mindedly. Finally, she glanced up again, eyes meeting mine, and I felt that familiar tingle, the one that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. "Bring it around later. We'll take a closer look," she said, voice casual but precise, carrying an undertone that said she knew more than she let on. I left the shop feeling both grounded and untethered, the fluorescent lights suddenly dimmer, the hum of machinery louder. I couldn't stop thinking about that brief pause, that small act of attention, the brush of her fingers. For reasons I didn't understand, I already knew I'd be back tomorrow, and the day after that, because something about her was worth whatever I might regret. The next afternoon, I found myself back in the repair shop, bike leaning against the rack as if it had become a permanent fixture in my life. She was there already, sleeves rolled up over a crisp blouse, hair tied back loosely, a streak of grease near her temple that made her look impossibly human, impossibly real. "You're early," she said, voice measured. There was a small crease between her brows, not irritation, exactly, but a subtle warning. "Don't get too close." I shrugged, trying to look casual. "You said bring it around." She sighed softly, almost inaudible, and led me to the garage bay. The smell of oil, rubber, and old metal wrapped around us. And for a moment, everything else felt distant, like the world had shrunk to just this space, her presence pressing against the edges of my awareness. As I watched her work, I couldn't help noticing the small details she didn't try to hide. The way her fingers moved deftly over the tools, the faint tremor in her hands when she reached for a wrench just out of habit, the quiet exhale she let out when a stubborn bolt finally loosened. "You don't usually let anyone do this part for you," I said, careful. She glanced at me, lips pressed into a thin line. Most people don't know what they're doing, she replied. But there was a softness underneath, a flicker of hesitation, like she was suddenly aware that I was watching her, not just her work, but her. I nodded slowly, letting her continue. My eyes drifted to the subtle signs of her fatigue, the faint dark circles beneath her eyes, the stiffness in her shoulders. She had a way of holding herself upright, controlled, precise, but if you looked closely enough, you could see the weight she carried quietly. Here, she said after a moment, holding a small, stubborn part out to me. Can you hand me the socket? Carefully. It's delicate. Her voice cracked slightly at the end, just enough for me to notice, enough to make the tension in my chest tighten. I passed her the tool with a steady hand, careful not to let my fingers linger, but when they brushed hers, it was electric, though neither of us said a word. There was a pause. She didn't look at me immediately. Her gaze dropped to the engine, and I didn't move, standing there, watching her laugh quietly at a joke muttered under her breath, hearing the almost imperceptible sigh that followed. For a moment, I imagined reaching out, brushing the strand of hair that had fallen over her temple, letting my thumb linger just enough to see if she'd flinch or lean in. But I didn't. I just stood there, quietly absorbing the rhythm of her movements, the soft cadence of her voice, the gentle tension that seemed to hum between us. Finally, she straightened, wiping her hands on a rag, eyes meeting mine for a fleeting second that lasted too long. It was charged, silent, a question neither of us dared to speak. And then she smiled. A hint, a flicker, brief, but enough to make my chest tighten. I left the bay feeling both invited and dismissed at the same time, carrying the quiet pull of her energy with me. Because whatever this was between us, it wasn't simple. And I wasn't ready to let it go. It was late when I returned to the shop, the rain hammering against the windows in uneven staccato. The fluorescent lights reflected off the wet pavement outside, making the garage glow like it was its own little world. She was there, sleeves rolled up again, leaning over the counter with a rag in her hands, eyes scanning invoices like they were fragile objects. "You're still here?" I asked, voice quieter than intended. She looked up, startled for a fraction of a second, and then closed her eyes, letting out a slow exhale. "Some of us have work to finish," she said, words clipped, but her shoulders slumping betrayed something. I wasn't sure if it was fatigue or something deeper. We moved around each other with the kind of rhythm that comes from familiarity, though we weren't close enough for comfort. I found myself reaching for tools she needed before she even asked, instinctively noticing the small movements, the slight tremor in her fingers as she held a wrench, the way she pushed a strand of hair behind her ear when she thought no one was watching. Then her phone buzzed on the counter. I saw her hesitation, the pause that split her attention. She glanced at it, a message from someone I didn't recognize, and her lips tightened. She didn't answer. Not immediately. "You okay?" I asked softly. She looked at me then, and for a moment, there was something fragile in her eyes, a vulnerability she didn't usually show. But the moment passed as quickly as it came, and she set the phone down, pretending it hadn't happened. "Fine," she said, voice a little too steady. I swallowed, feeling the pull of wanting to say something. Anything, but the words lodged in my throat. It wasn't my place. I knew it, but still I stayed. Close enough to notice the warmth radiating off her, the faint scent of coffee clinging to her sweater, the way her breath caught slightly when she realized how close I had moved. At one point, our hands brushed while tightening a bolt. I froze. Her eyes flicked up to mine, wide just enough to make my chest tighten, then quickly averted. My pulse thrummed in my ears as I imagined saying something, confessing the truth I hadn't dared to put into words yet. But the moment passed, the bolt secured, and we returned to our tasks, pretending nothing had shifted. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, the tension hung thicker than the humid air. I wanted to reach for her, to steady her hands, or maybe just touch her arm, but the weight of restraint kept me rooted. My mind raced, imagining the consequences, the what-ifs, the regrets that would follow if I crossed that invisible line. And yet, for one fleeting second, I almost did. Leaning just slightly closer, the space between us shrinking with every heartbeat. I could feel her warmth as if it had been waiting for me. Then the door creaked. A customer entering, an interruption, a reminder of the world outside this small, charged bubble. She straightened immediately, stepping back, professional and distant once more. I stepped back too, silently cursing the interruption, my chest tight with the almostness of it all. And still, as I left the bay that night, the image of her fragile smile and the warmth brushing against my skin haunted me, a near confession that never left our lips. The shop was quiet that evening. The hum of the overhead lights the only sound beyond the faint drip of water from the roof. I was bent over the bike, checking a chain that didn't need checking, while she moved behind the counter, cataloging parts with meticulous attention. But there was a tension now, thicker than before, like the air itself had caught its breath. Finally, she set the last box down and leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Her eyes met mine, steady, unflinching, and something about that gaze made me stop in my tracks. "What are we doing?" she asked, voice low, almost a whisper, but it cut through the space between us sharper than any words I'd ever heard. I froze. For a moment, I couldn't answer. Part of me wanted to joke, deflect, make light of it, but the raw honesty in her eyes demanded truth. I swallowed, hands gripping the edge of the bike, knuckles white. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice quieter than I expected. She stepped closer, and the small distance between us felt like a canyon. The scent of her, coffee, faint perfume, something warm I couldn't name, hit me suddenly, and I realized how much I'd memorized these little things without even trying. "We're like this," she said, gesturing vaguely. "But it shouldn't be." Her hesitation was everything. I wanted to bridge the space, to reach out, but I didn't. Because touching her, even slightly, would change something irrevocably. And yet, standing there, so close, I could feel the weight of the words neither of us wanted to say. We stared at each other for long seconds that stretched into minutes. Her fingers brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear. My eyes traced the subtle fatigue in her face, the curve of her jaw, the faint tremor in her hands. We were two people orbiting something neither of us fully understood, caught between desire, restraint, and fear. "I'm scared," she admitted finally, voice barely audible, but it landed with gravity. The shop seemed to shrink around us, the air thick with what we weren't saying, the confessions suspended in silence. I wanted to tell her everything, about the way my chest tightens when she's near, how her laugh haunts me even when I'm alone, how I can't stop thinking about her. But the words lodged themselves in my throat. So instead, I let the silence answer for me. She stepped back slowly, folding her arms again, but the tension didn't dissipate. It hovered, pressing against the walls, against our ribs. "I don't want to ruin anything," she whispered, almost to herself, almost to me, and the vulnerability in her voice pierced me in a way I hadn't anticipated. I nodded, though it felt meaningless. My hands dropped from the bike, fingers brushing over the cool metal, and I realized I was holding my own breath, waiting, unsteady. And then, in that quiet, charged space, she said something that broke me entirely. "Maybe we should just stop pretending we're fine." The words hung between us, devastating in their simplicity. And as I looked at her, I knew I would never be able to forget that look, that admission, that fragile honesty. I found her in the corner of the shop that evening, curled up on a worn stool with a stack of invoices I hadn't seen before. Her shoulders slumped, her usual composure frayed at the edges. For the first time, she didn't glance up when I entered, didn't offer that small, sharp smile that had become my anchor. "You okay?" I asked, cautious, my voice low. She hesitated, fingers twisting a pen in her hand. "It's nothing," she said, but the way she avoided my eyes told me everything. I stepped closer, hands tucked in my pockets, pretending to inspect a nearby tool. "I don't believe in nothing," I said softly. "You can tell me." A long pause. Then, quietly, almost as if speaking to herself, she said, "I lost someone once a long time ago. Someone I thought I could count on." Her voice cracked slightly at the edges, and I saw the barest tremor in her hands. I didn't reach out, not yet. Instead, I let the silence settle, letting her own words hang between us. "I'm sorry," I said finally, and it felt too small. "I can't imagine." She shook her head. "No one can." But she drew in a shaky breath. "It makes it hard sometimes to trust, to let someone in." Her gaze flicked up to mine, eyes raw but carefully controlled. "Even when you want to." I nodded slowly, the weight of her confession settling in my chest. I remembered a photo I'd glimpsed the other day, tucked into a corner of the counter. A woman, smiling warmly, holding a coffee cup, her hair in the same loose style she wore now. I hadn't known who she was, but suddenly it all made sense. The quiet sadness in her eyes, the way she hesitated, the subtle withdrawal when things got close. "You miss her," I said softly, almost a whisper, not sure if I should. Her eyes widened, and then, for the first time, she let herself look at me fully. "I do," she admitted, voice trembling. "Every day." I wanted to tell her that people can hurt, and that losing someone doesn't mean losing the chance to find something real. But instead, I just nodded, standing there, noticing the way her fingers clenched the pen, the faint shake in her shoulders, the way she exhaled sharply as if releasing something she'd been holding for years. For a long moment, we simply stood there, side by side in the dim light of the shop. The storm outside had passed, but the atmosphere inside carried a different kind of tremor, something fragile, quiet, but seismic in its effect. Finally, she looked at me, eyes glistening. "I didn't mean to tell you that," she whispered. I shook my head gently. "No," I said, voice soft but certain. "I'm glad you did." She blinked, a small, tentative smile forming, fragile as thin glass. And for reasons I didn't fully understand, I felt like the world had shifted slightly. Something delicate and unsteady, but real, had moved between us. Her hand brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, and for one suspended heartbeat, the air between us seemed electric. And I knew, without words, that nothing would ever feel the same again. The shop was nearly empty that evening, the hum of the lights softer than usual. Outside, dusk had settled, painting the windows in muted amber. She was at the counter, sorting tools, and I lingered near the bay, pretending to check bolts I already knew were fine. We moved around each other with that careful rhythm that had become ours. No words needed, no overt gestures, just a shared awareness of space. But tonight, it felt different. The tension that had hovered for weeks had softened, as though acknowledging itself was enough to make it tangible. She looked up once, catching my gaze, and for a brief second, the world narrowed to that. The tiredness in her eyes was still there, but so was something else, a quiet acceptance, a subtle permission for me to be close without fear. I'm glad you stayed," she said finally, voice low, almost hesitant. I didn't answer immediately. I just walked closer, hands tucked in my pockets, noting the slight curl of her fingers on the counter, the faint exhale as she leaned forward. "Me too," I said at last, soft enough that it didn't feel like a confession, just truth. We lingered near the tools, side by side, letting the silence stretch comfortably for the first time. No one was watching. No obligations pressed in. The space between us wasn't charged with anxiety, only quiet understanding. Her hand moved slightly, brushing against mine as she reached for a wrench. Neither of us pulled away. Instead, our fingers lingered, brushing once, twice, just enough for the warmth to sink in. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was human. It was the slow recognition that proximity could be a choice, a decision made quietly, together. She looked up at me then, eyes soft, lips barely curved, and I felt the weight of all the unspoken words between us. The near confessions, the awkward silences, the shared glances, they all led to this. A quiet acknowledgement that whatever had been building, however messy or uncertain, was real. I stepped a little closer, letting my shoulder brush hers, careful not to crowd, careful to let the moment breathe. She didn't move away. Instead, she exhaled slowly, as if she'd been holding her breath without realizing it, and leaned slightly into me. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The world outside the shop, the deadlines, the worries, the past heartbreaks, didn't exist for those minutes. There was only this. Two people, imperfect and tentative, choosing the same small closeness over uncertainty. Finally, she pulled her hand from the counter and let it rest lightly over mine, palm against palm, fingers curling just enough to anchor herself and me in the present. I felt a quiet surge of relief and inevitability, not a declaration of love, but the acknowledgement that whatever this was, it had arrived and could no longer be ignored. I leaned slightly, resting my forehead just briefly against hers, a simple contact that sealed the weight of everything without a word. When we finally pulled back, our eyes met, soft smiles forming. No grand gestures, no dramatics, just the quiet certainty that this was real. And for the first time, the shop felt like home, in the way only shared understanding and mutual choice can make a place feel safe. I remember that evening like it happened yesterday. Even though weeks have passed, the shop was quiet, just like before, but it felt different, lighter, warmer, almost like the air itself had shifted. She was there, sleeves rolled up, hair loosely tied, the small streak of gray catching the light. I watched her for a moment, as I always do, noticing the subtle curve of her smile, the way her hands moved over the tools with the same precision, but now without tension. We moved through our routine, side by side, but it wasn't about routine anymore. It was about choice. Every glance, every small gesture, every silence was intentional, shared, and understood. I caught myself smiling without reason, simply because she existed in the same space, because the awkward pauses that once made my chest tighten now felt like breathing, necessary, grounding. I think what changed most wasn't the world around us, but ourselves. She let down her walls, just slightly, enough for trust to begin again. And I stopped trying to force words or actions to fill the gaps. I learned that sometimes, love doesn't need declarations. It needs presence. It needs noticing the small things, the tremor in a hand, the faint laugh that comes unexpectedly, the way someone folds themselves into a chair next to you and somehow makes space for both your pasts. We didn't rush. We didn't create a dramatic moment with fireworks or confessions shouted over rain. Instead, it was simple, shared space, shared understanding, and the quiet certainty that whatever we had was earned. The slow burn, the near misses, the unspoken confessions, they all led to this calm afterglow, the kind that hums softly under your ribs and doesn't need to shout to exist. She caught me staring once, laughing lightly, and said, "You're still noticing everything, huh?" I nodded. "I can't help it," I admitted, because it was true. I noticed everything about her, and every detail was a reminder of how far we'd come, of how fragile and beautiful trust and connection could be. Sometimes I think about how we almost let it slip through our fingers, how easy it would have been to misunderstand, to retreat, to pretend nothing had happened. But here we are, and I think that's what real love is. Choosing, every day, to stay present with someone imperfect and extraordinary all at once. We still work in that shop, still tease and joke, still have moments where words aren't enough. But now, there's a quiet certainty, a shared rhythm, a warmth that lingers without demand. It's not perfect, it's ours. And as I watch her from across the room now, hand brushing against mine in that familiar, effortless way, I smile to myself, knowing that some things are worth waiting for, worth the tension, worth every almost and every pause. So, if you've ever wondered whether the slow, messy, quiet kind of love is real, well, it is. And sometimes, it's the only kind that lasts. Have you ever noticed the little moments that make love inevitable?